So tonight we're assessing President Cyril Ramaphosa's cabinet reshuffle. There were 2 vacancies to be filled after the Minister of Environmental Affairs, Edna Molewa, passed away, and the Minister of Home Affairs, Malusi Gigaba, resigned under a cloud of controversy. The President didn't go much further than filling those vacancies. No one was fired, which means one of the most controversial ministers, Stella Ndabeni-Abrahams, has survived this cabinet reshuffle. Here's a reminder of the limited changes that were announced today. Who was the Minister of Communications, is now the Minister of Environmental Affairs. Siyabonga Ncwele is the new Minister of Home Affairs. He is vacating the Ministry of Telecommunications and Postal Services. And then we have Stella Ndabeni-Abrahams, who will head up the Communications Ministry. Ndabeni-Abrahams was the Deputy Minister of Telecommunications and Postal Services, so she will remain in that ministry as well, because President Ramaphosa says communications and postal services will be merged after the 2019 elections. Well, to discuss, we're now joined via Skype by political analyst Melanie Verwoerd, and here in studio by the Director of Research at Auwal Socio-Economic Research Institute, Angelo Fick. Welcome to you, and welcome to you, Melanie, over Skype. Let's start with you. No one was fired here. It's a mini cabinet reshuffle, I guess. Do you think this is too softly, especially when Stella Ndabeni remains?
Well, it is clearly a light cabinet. It's not really a shuffle. It's basically a way of filling vacancies that were there. It was very clear that even though he had put Derek Hanekom and Bladen Zamandi in as ministers who were just taking care of those departments, that those are 2 big portfolios. You can't just leave them vacant for another 6 months until the elections. We must remember that President Ramaphosa said when he appointed his original cabinet that he did not want to do many changes. He wasn't going to do what Jacob Zuma did with constant shuffles, because it creates instability in the cabinet and in ministries and in their departments as well. But Stella Ndabeni, I think she's definitely on her way out. But I think the president, as he has done with Shaun Abrams, with Tamuyani and others, he's going to let the court processes play out first. And of course, the DA has launched an action in the courts and allow that to play itself out. He has in my view, a limited amount of people that he can just directly remove before it causes huge political problems and backlashes for him inside the ANC. And so I think what he's doing now is still what is his problem has been since Nasrec, is that he's trying to straddle these divides inside the ANC and trying to do whatever he does in such a way that it doesn't cause too much political problems for him.
Well, what do you think, Angelo? Because Ramaphosa has in fact handed in notice of intention to oppose that DA application. So he's fighting for her job rather than firing her.
Well, I think it would be La Land to imagine that a president of a party who happens to be the president of a country 7 months before a general election is going to fire the president of the Women's League of his party from cabinet. I think that the 2019 general elections will be the test for members of cabinet currently sitting pretty that many South Africans want to have removed. Cyril Ramaphosa actually fired his first salvo across the bow today by indicating that in the wake of that election, the 6th administration will see a radically reoriented cabinet with the focus on their plan. And what he's doing here is stabilizing government and the executive particularly by simply moving people around so that not a whole lot of new blood comes in and there isn't a lot of bleeding from people who suffer as a consequence of being removed from this cabinet and take out, as Melanie Verwoerd pointed out, their anger or their revenge inside the party structures.
Could this even mean that he was actually being authentic when he said, I want to work with former political enemies, people who supported Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma?
Well, also, this is about unity, right? So we have various people inside the party calling for unity across the space in South Africa, but also I think it's very important to recognize that he is playing a very specific political game, which is to hold things in a pattern until that election. And as he told us today, in the wake of that election, there will probably be a radical scaling back of the size of cabinet, of the executive altogether. So we will probably have fewer deputy ministers, fewer ministries, and then a consolidation. Because let's not forget that this cabinet expanded under the second Zuma administration. partly to give people rewards for actions that they were performing inside the party, and that in a space where South Africa's economy is where it is, it's probably in the interest of Cyril Ramaphosa to run a government that's leaner and meaner in the wake of that election in 2019.
Well, Melanie, do you think there was an opportunity lost here, perhaps, in terms of that size? So he's merged two ministries, like you said, some deputy ministers going, but we still have 3 ministers in the economic cluster and a lot of confusion around that.
I don't know if there's really confusion around that. There shouldn't be. But the thing is, I mean, he's made it very clear that he's going to reduce his cabinet. But again, what he cannot afford at the moment is, firstly, an issue inside the ANC. And inevitably, that's what's going to happen. If he starts amalgamating departments now, what will happen, or ministries now? What will happen is inevitably that he will get rid of some of the previous Zuma supporters. And he doesn't want that to cause a hassle for him now. He just doesn't need that at the moment. He needs to be able to focus on governing and then also on running the elections, or winning the elections for the ANC. But the second issue, of course, is that when you amalgamate ministries and departments, you lose people. It's very rare that it wouldn't make any sense to just reduce cabinet if you're not going to reduce departments as well. And therefore, you start losing civil servants. And again, in a year, which is now heading very quickly towards an election, we're most probably about 6 months at most out, you do not want great unhappiness amongst your civil servants, and more importantly for Cyril Ramaphosa, you do not want to create an issue with COSATU. So you do not want the trade unions now to get very unhappy because you're suddenly getting rid of a lot of posts. And we already know that things are there with the SABC. There's most probably going to be a problem with Eskom. So he wants to minimize that as long as he can, and certainly until the elections. But I have no doubt that after the elections, and as Angelo has just said, that we will see a radical reduction in both cabinet and in their departments.
So before we get to the individuals, Angelo, just the last word on this. So you said this is his political strategy, but do you think it'll work?
I think
the softly approach, I guess.
I don't think it's a softly approach. It's an approach of timing. So it is, you cannot
wait and see approach.
Or not even wait and see, but take your cuts at the point at which it is best served for both you as head of party and you as head of government. So if he does it now, as Melanie has pointed out, what you have is bleeding across the party, and what you also have is instability inside cabinet because people will fear that they will be next. So people start, you create the distrust that we've heard at the State Capture Commission from Pravin Gordhan existed in the latter years of the Zuma administration inside cabinet. So this is about timing to create stability in government, but also maneuvering people around so that, they cannot really call on a history of achievement because this will be Nomvula Mokonyane's second redeployment since January.
Well, let's talk about Nomvula Mokonjane because there was controversy over her time in water before she moved to communications. Yes, and this is an important time for the SABC, the delayed digital migration. So what do we read into this? Could she not be trusted with communications, Angela?
Well, I don't know if she couldn't be trusted, but clearly in his words around her replacement, he indicated that this was a time for this ministry to not just be consolidated with those two sets of services, postal and telecommunications and communication, but to focus on government's policy and to actually implement it, because South Africa remains really far behind on the digital migration, and that's not serving the country well. There are consequences for that. The issues of data, the issues around questions of telecommunications rollout, all of that will have to be resolved because there's an election coming, and South Africans have actually spoken quite loudly about their unhappiness with the way in which certain kinds of digital services work, and corporate South Africa has indicated its unhappiness around the television digital migration and the radio digital migration. So there are real concerns around broadcasting. Nomvula Mokonjane, I think her redeployment is also, she must be kept in cabinet because she's a vote winner. We know that she's an ardent campaigner for the ANC. She gets people out to vote. She is a really good party cadre. And you don't punish party cadres simply because you think of them as enemies in that sense. I don't think Cyril Ramaphosa, for all my critiques of him, is that short-sighted a politician. It's not how he got into power in his party, and it's not how he wrestled control of the presidency away from a man who had no reason to leave until that election next year, Jacob Zuma.
Melanie, how do you view Nomvula Mokonjane's redeployment?
I think it's an absolute disaster for the environment. I mean, you said there was some unhappiness around her ministry and particularly around the water affairs when she was Minister of Water Affairs. I think that's putting it very mildly. I mean, it was a disaster and a failure of epic proportions. Remember, she bankrupted that department according to the Auditor General and in parliamentary committees' investigations afterwards. And it's very worrying that she is now at Environmental Affairs. Because, you know, even though the election is relatively close in terms of parliamentary procedures, that they won't get very crucial things going through Parliament, she can still do a lot of damage before the elections. And there are some very crucial and key issues on her desk at the moment that you will find there. Things around pollution targets, which comes to ESCOM, climate change policy, issues around wildlife policy, specifically the canned lion hunting, and various others, for example, also the mining rights. That is such a hard issue, and that was even in court today with a victory there for the communities. So it's a very, very crucial portfolio for us and as citizens of this country. And, you know, her history is not great in terms of ministry. Yes, I agree that she has been powerful she is powerful in the ANC. But of course, she was also a very, very strong Zuma supporter. So hopefully she won't be able to do too much damage until the election, and hopefully this is a sort of exit strategy for her from cabinet.
Following your line of thought, can she not do less damage? I think we haven't spoken enough about this delayed digital migration. It's affecting the poor who need access to internet to get jobs. I think that has been tragic.
I think it's absolutely tragic, but it shows that she's not a very good minister. She might be a good vote winner for the ANC, but she's not a good minister. So maybe it's time to deploy her to Lutuli House. Because yes, of course, the digital migration is very important, but so is fresh air. So is clean water, so is water provision, and so is, you know, an environment that will still exist for our children to enjoy. And so I don't think it should be a choice. I think, you know, this is absolutely crucial that we get ministers who can actually deliver, and I'm sure that's what Cyril Ramaphosa wants as well. But I think, again, you know, because we are in an election here, we're sort of in a place-holding space with cabinet. And yes, he didn't want to get rid of her, so, you know, she got into environment.
What do you think, Angelo? Her track record in water, and now she's in an environmental ministry.
Well, the South African government's record on environmental issues, both locally as well as regionally and internationally, is not a very good one. It speaks the speak, but it actually doesn't walk the talk. So what you have is, in Mpumalanga, we have the choices around coal, you have issues around, you know, the resurgence of rhetoric and actually propaganda from civil servants around nuclear. When there's no discussion of what happens to the waste, what happens to communities that have to put up with this waste. So, you know, when it comes to questions of the environment, we're really not that progressive in terms of action. So poaching continues, you know, and that's species decimation of a certain kind. The discussions around what's going on, for example, in the Western Cape, with wetlands being totally decimated and people's food sources being at risk, particularly poor people's food sources being at risk, and the consequences of climate change, we really haven't had a serious discussion about that in South Africa. And so when I hear about mitigation, it's often a very middle-class discussion. And so how it's going to affect the mass of South Africans who don't live those, you know, protected lives, that I think is a crucial issue. And I think this idea that the environment is a kind of nice to have, as Melanie points out, it is the base, it is the rock on which the rest of the civilization is built. And there I think it's not just an issue of local, but our relationship with our partners internationally. If we say we take moral leadership, this is the future of our children and our children's children. The UN told us we have 12 years. And actually this year is over, so we now have 11.
Yeah.
To fix this problem, to do the things that are required in order not to exacerbate climate change, which is real, and catapult us into an environment in the second half of the century that is actually uninhabitable.
Okay, so if we're not taking that seriously enough, is he taking communications enough by deploying Stella Ndabeni-Abrahams?
My sense is that what he's done there is taken a career official, somebody who served in the deputy ministry in that position through 2.5 administrations, so to speak, and presumably as somebody with the junior position in that post, she can now be tasked to actually fulfill what this administration in its dying days for the next 7 months want to have fulfilled, because it's also part of that renewal, that new dawn, that idea of government doing its business. Whether or not she does it will be her test, because if she performs in it, she can look forward to presumably surviving the 2019 election cull and maintaining her position in cabinet. My concern, of course, is with the third minister and his redeployment into Home Affairs.
Okay, let's get to him, but a quick comment from you on our new communications minister, who famously had that terrible relationship with Faith Matambe. So I guess we're moving away from that, Melanie.
Yes, but it did show that she had some backbone. Because she did a very unpopular and even dangerous thing by disagreeing so publicly with her minister, who was a very strong and remains a very strong supporter of Zuma. She's very experienced, as Angelo indicated. She's been there for more than 7 years in some or other position in that ministry. So she knows it, the ins and outs of it. I mean, before that, she was also a whip in Parliament for the Communication Committee. So she's very, very experienced. So not surprising that the president took her. She also importantly represents the youth. The idea of youth is taken very widely and liberally. But of course, with Malusi Gigaba gone, the cabinet has aged again quite a bit on average. And there's been a very, very big push in the ANC for more younger people to be in cabinet. And so she represents that, which is very helpful. And of course, she is a very strong supporter of President Ramaphosa. And so he gets a pair of safe hands in her. She's very well known in the Eastern Cape to have promoted the case of the Ramaphosa faction, and during that conference of chairs, she played a key role in securing support for the Ramaphosa faction. And so I think he gets a very safe pair of hands in her.
So she's young but experienced. I really wish her well. She's dealing with the SABC as well. Your concerns with Siyabonga Ncwele, Angela?
So Mr. Ncwele is probably most famous in South Africa for once having been the Minister of State Security or Intelligence Services, because that post shifted, with a partner who, was then implicated in all sorts of malfeasance.
In drug dealing.
In drug dealing, international drug dealing, actually went to prison. It's an ex-partner at this point, we must clarify that. But my concern is that Home Affairs was moved into the security cluster in 2017, and what we now have is a securocrat in charge of Home Affairs. And the whole point, I think, in post-apartheid South Africa is to, move away from the securocratic position. Over the last 10 years of the Zuma administration and the late Thabo Mbeki administration, securocratic approaches to the world really have increased in the South African government sector. And my concern here is whether or not he does.
Angelo, because the concern has been we have politicians who don't know their portfolios very well. It's all political. Now you're raising an issue about securocrats.
So this is people who I think have this idea that the South African state is potentially under siege and have a quite, shall we say, militaristic approach to dealing with this. So examples,
paranoid.
Yes. So the examples of the securocratic approaches would have been the kinds of charging students with treason for protesting at Parliament, invoking apartheid-era legislation around, key points and secrecy, the kinds of legislation around secrets and publication that have been circulating around, the Secrecy Acts. And Jane Duncan and the Freedom of Expression Institute have, for the last decade, objected to the kinds of returns to an apartheid-era approach to secrecy, and that really shuts down on transparency and does not protect whistleblowers. Home Affairs has been moved into the security cluster because people have been given the scaremongering idea that Home Affairs is partly responsible for border control and our borders are porous, and we've seen this return of the kind of xenophobic discourse ahead of an election that really is very dangerous in South Africa. And my concern around putting a securocrat in Home Affairs is that the governance factor, which is what Home Affairs should be about, gets secondary position, and this anxiety around rooting out illegal foreigners and getting rid of people who shouldn't be here really is not a good idea, because I think we left that South Africa behind, and the vision through the Freedom Charter and the Constitution is a much more progressive vision. And we are at the African Union talking about porous borders in Africa for trade, for movement of people, and then you put this ex-securocrat, ex-security minister, ex-intelligence services minister inside this portfolio, which a year and a half ago, got moved into the security cluster. And so the concern here is, are we actually returning to and kind of solidifying this idea of Home Affairs as being much more about security than it is about governance.
And we've seen recently how Home Affairs can affect tourism, which we desperately need. Melanie, do you share any of those concerns?
I do, and I was going to raise the point about tourism, which is the point that you just raised, because we know what a devastating effect that some of the visa regulations had on tourism. And that needs to be fixed, and we know the intention is there to fix it. Announcements have been made, but it seems not having been implemented yet. And so it's such an important portfolio. It's such a massive department which touches so many lives, in terms of whether it delivers, who it keeps in and out of the country, and then of course whether it promotes tourism. And of course we must remember that tourism is one of the few areas in our country which can massively create jobs at the right level in a very quick way in the upcoming years, something we desperately need. And in that process, the Department of Home Affairs plays a phenomenal role. So it is a very, very key portfolio. And yes, again, it's interesting that the president chose somebody like Cwele to do that.
Melanie, we're running out of time. I'm going to give you both an opportunity to say very quickly, if this is about Cyril Ramaphosa's leadership, how's he done? How's the ANC looking ahead of elections? Quickly.
I personally think he's being very strategic. I keep on hearing people saying he's weak or he has no backbone because he is so strategic. I know Cyril Ramaphosa, and my experience with him is that he's a master strategist. Very few politicians can beat him at that. He's playing a very carefully balanced game to both keep the country afloat and going in the right direction, and of course also politically survive through the elections. At the moment, I think the ANC looks fairly well. The opinion polls don't raise anything that is majorly concerning at this stage. Hopefully he can get around the 60% for the ANC, not because I'm a particularly big ANC supporter for that matter, but because it is important for his own survival. And I think we need Cyril Ramaphosa for the next 5 to 10 years if we want racial harmony, economic growth, and prosperity in this country.
Last word, Angela.
So I think this was Cyril Ramaphosa doing the administrative thing that he is expected to do, which is to replace people who had either died or had resigned. I don't read strength or weakness into this act. I simply read this as what we expect of him to do. How the ANC looks ahead of the election, I think it's a little early to tell, because as we know, come January, the ANC cadres will be out there doing their thing. We have an opposition in slight disarray and in some kind of confusion, which is good for the governing party. Whether this is good for the citizenry of South Africa is a different question, because I think what people have to do in contemporary South Africa is not sigh with such great relief about what they've just survived over the last 8 years, and not do what we didn't do for those 8 years, which is to hold officials to account and to ask probing questions of our elected officials and our appointed officials to make sure that they're doing things in our interest as 58 million people, and not for the elites or for the people who support them financially or support them politically, because that would be a repeat of the last 8 years, and that's a hurdle we cannot cross a second time.
All right. Thank you so much for both of you being with us tonight. Your insightful analysis, political analyst Melanie Verwoerd and Director of Research at the Auwal Socio-Economic Research Institute, Angelo Fick.